Wow, what a great song and beautifully delivered. Thank you so much. We'll hear the Word of God from Romans chapter 1, verses 18, 20, and 21. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of human beings who suppress the truth in their wickedness. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. The Word of God. My senior year in college, I had the roommate from hell, or so it seemed to me. There's two things he did that really irritated me. I'm an early morning guy. I get up, I get going, I like that about myself. And we shared a room in an apartment. There were actually 3 other guys in the house or the apartment. And I would get up, I would shower, I'd get dressed, I'd get ready to go to the college, and I would be cooking breakfast, and he could lay in bed and see me through the hallway into the kitchen. Still laying in bed. He hasn't gotten up and done a darn thing. But he'd always say, "Oh, Ben, what are you making?" I said, "Eggs." "Well, could you just throw another egg in for me?" "Oatmeal. Just some more water and oat to cook for me." And he never got up, never made eggs, never cooked. I never got to ask him for that favor. He just always asked and laid in bed. That really irritated me. Now, the other thing he did was he would come in, and at night he would undress on the way to bed. So you could come in and you'd see starting in the living room, you could see pants, underwear, shoes, t-shirt, and there'd be a trail through the living room into the hallway and into our bedroom. And sometimes they would lay there for days. And one time he left his pants right in front of my chest of drawers, to where I had to go like this to open them. Had 3 of them. Or stand on them. But, I wanted to be courteous, and the idiot would leave his clothes, and he didn't pick them up. So one night, they'd been here for days, and one night he's sitting at his desk in our bedroom, and he's studying, and I said, "Jim, will you pick up these pants?" No, I think I said, "Jim, pick up these pants." He turned around and says, "When I'm ready." So I picked them up, opened the window of our apartment, and dropped them out the window. Then I'll come back to that later on. 7 deadly sins. The topic raises a few questions immediately, like, only 7? Is that all there is? Oh, there's a lot more, but many Christian thinkers, for centuries have believed that these 7 sort of encompass and sum up all the rest. They can be a good way to understand all the rest. And why should you care about knowing what they are? Well, that takes more thought. And I want to start with a big picture and then narrow it back down to each of us personally, as in my apartment when I was a senior in college. But the big picture goes, let me give you one angle on it. World War I. Sin did not begin with the First World War. Happened about 90 years ago, near the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a great illustration of this pride, the first of the deadly sins. Little history. The 20th century began with optimism. The idea of progress was the popular philosophy, and then there were all these unprecedented advances in science and technology combined with this new theory, or relatively new theory, of evolution. And all this together seemed to say that humankind was climbing up the ladder of progress. All of us were getting better. Every day, in every way. Then came the First World War. 65 million men were mobilized to fight in that war. 10 million were killed. 20 million were wounded. In 1920, Winston Churchill, who at this time was in the cabinet of the Prime Minister, he wasn't yet Prime Minister, that would come some years later, he looked back just a couple of years before and wrote about what it was like to be in this First World War with all this modern weaponry. And it's a longer quote than I usually like to read in chapel, but this is so amazing. He wrote, all the horrors of the ages were brought together. And not only armies, but whole populations were thrust into the midst of them. Neither peoples or rulers drew the line at any deed they thought would help them to win. The wounded died between the lines. The dead moldered into the soil. I mean, they just rotted into the soil. Merchant ships and neutral ships and hospital ships were sunk on the seas, and all on board were left to their fate or killed as they swam. Every effort was made to starve whole populations into submission without regard to age or sex. Cities and monuments were smashed by artillery. Bombs from the air were cast down indiscriminately. Poison gas in many forms stifled or seared the soldiers. That was mustard gas. Liquid fire was projected upon their bodies. Men fell from the air in flames or were smothered often slowly in the dark recesses of the sea. When all was over, torture and cannibalism were the only two expedients that the civilized, scientific, Christian states had been able to deny themselves. And they were of doubtful utility. Big picture. And the events that have followed that war, right down to the present, have shown that it was not a freak occurrence. It was and has been the theme of the century. And the worst part hasn't been war. The greatest killer in the 20th century has been governments. I mean, cautious estimates, these are cautious, have it at somewhere between 80 and 100 million people murdered by their governments. Well known as Hitler and his 6 million Jews. Not so well known as Stalin and his 80 million Ukrainians systematically starved to death. And God knows how many more in the Gulag. The Armenians and Cambodians have their own story of horror, as do the Chinese, the Ugandans, the Ethiopians, and the people of Darfur. What are we to make of this? Joseph Conrad wrote a letter to Bertrand Russell in 1922. And his explanation is as sober and as biblical as any I've ever read. I have never been able to find in any man's book or any man's talk anything convincing enough to stand up for a moment against my deep-seated sense of fatality governing this man-inhabited world. The only remedy for us, and this phrase is biblical, the only remedy for us is the change of hearts. But looking at the history of the past 2,000 years, there's not much reason to expect that thing. Even if man has taken to flying, man doesn't fly like an eagle. He flies like a beetle. So, big picture. There's a flaw in our hearts that no political system can correct. In fact, as history has shown, governments seem only to magnify it. The murderous deeds of nation states are our own murderous hearts writ large. The chaos of the world is a mirror of the chaos in our hearts. So, after I threw his pants out the window, he quietly got up and walked over to the top of my chest of drawers, pulled it out, and dumped it on the floor. So I walked over to his desk and just put my arm on the top of the desk and just swept everything off on the floor. Well, the other two roommates heard the noise, and they were by now standing in the doorway watching this. He walked over and took the second drawer out and dumped it on the floor. I walked over to his bed, and I tore all the covers off. He walked over to the third drawer, dumped it on the floor. I didn't know what else to do, so I pushed him. It wasn't like this. It was like this. And the other two roommates were between us. We calmed down. It was late. Time to go to sleep. We both got in bed. But the light was on. And I said, Jim, you were the last to get in bed. Would you turn off the light, please? Nothing. Well, I'm not going to get up and turn off that stupid light. So we laid there, pretending to sleep. And a long time passed. You guys, the seeds of Auschwitz and Dachau, the seeds of the Gulag, the seeds of every war that's ever been fought, the seeds of every marriage that's ever fallen apart, the seeds of hatred and racism, they're all there in that bedroom of these two college guys.